I'm really hoping that I can explain what this is and inspire you to play around with it and understand how to do it yourself in 15 minutes. So we'll see what I can do. Right, so let's get started. So I did call the talk Responsive Web Design is Dead, but I thought that was a bit violent, even if it is, you know, just a figure of speech. But yeah, I'm a bit of a Disney fan, so anyone here a Disney theme parks fan? No one's putting their hand up? Yeah, a couple of people, yeah. Yeah, this is a picture of an old ride called Horizons at Epcot, which was one of those like kind of like things in the 80s giving you like a vision of the future, which was really cool. So yeah, I thought that would be a good metaphor for where we're going today with the web. So there's a great big beautiful tomorrow. And hello, I'm Josh. So I am from Chester. I've been working at the BBC. Well, I don't live in Chester anymore, but I've been working at the BBC for about 3.5 years, 4 years. So I guess I call myself a web developer, although I'm technically a software engineer. I love what I do. I'm a big web standards nerd, and I'm in a new team that we have in the BBC called Core Services. Anyone in Core Services, give me a whoop. Woo! So we've got Keith here, our head of product, Matt Card over there in my team as well, and we've got Callum, who's on the graduate scheme here, who's joined the team who are working on the back end for it, the business layer. Cool. So, excuse me, let's make a start. Right, so this is the agenda. Is that the right word? This is where we're going with the talk. So I thought I'd tell you about the situation we're in today with the web, like why it's the way it is. And because I think it's good to get that context. And then I'll talk about where we're going into tomorrow with this amazing world of intrinsic web design. And I'll try and squeeze that bit in at the end where I kind of talk about how exactly you do it. So yeah, this is the world of today. There you go, another Disneyland photo. Right, so who remembers websites like this? They were fun, weren't they? So there's been kind of different eras, I guess you could say, in how we've laid out things on the web. So it all started with what we now call the flow layout, but there wasn't really a name for it before because that was the only thing you could do. So the flow layout is basically where you have all these blocks and they appear one after the other. Simple as that. That's all you could do. And also in this screenshot as well, like it was probably even before the days of CSS when all you could do was like just use HTML attributes to put background images on things like on stuff and things like that, which was a bit of a mess. So yeah, then we moved on to the days where people discovered that they could use the table element to cheat a bit and actually use it for laying out your website, which was, well, it was great because you can make all these amazing layouts that you just couldn't do before. But it was also really awful and really bad for screen readers because, like, screen reader users, imagine, like, like what you'd be hearing, like having a page like that being described to you would be an absolute mess. So, yeah, we realized that was a bad idea. And then also, I guess, about maybe 10 years ago now, when smartphones kind of came about, we started having this concept of mobile websites and desktop websites. So you might remember like a lot of websites you go on, and it's still like that today. Websites you go on, they would have this .m at the beginning of the domain name, and that would be like your much smaller version of the website designed for mobile phones. So we had this kind of divide between mobile and desktop, and it would cause like little issues, like maybe the mobile website would have slightly less content on it, so your experience was a bit crap if you were on your mobile. And then you'd go, right, well, better go on my computer at home then and view the full website to actually get the content that I want or whatever it is. So this is what it would look like, and we'd be using this, what you might call like these methods of fluid and fixed layouts. So these are where we were typically using the float left or float right property in CSS to kind of have things arranged side by side. But that's not what floats were designed for. They were designed for just having like little images in the corner of your article or something like that and have the text kind of go around it like that. So yeah, it was clever. Like it was really clever, and it gave us lots of different layouts like on the web. So you get all these websites where they would use float left on the desktop to have things laid out side by side, like in this image here for the old weather website. And yeah, you'd probably set percentages or no, actually, yeah, what we would do in those days as well, we would just say, right, the whole website is going to be like 900 pixels wide or something like that. And then you'd specify in pixels how big all the columns are and things like that. And then on a mobile website, everything was just in one column, probably more using that flow layout. And maybe if you did have things side by side, they'd be using percentages to lay them all out. And then this amazing article appeared one day on A List Apart, if anyone's ever read A List Apart, amazing website. And it was an article by a guy called Ethan Marcotte. Has anyone ever heard of this article or read it? It's really amazing. It's like, this was revolutionary at the time. Like, he was coming along and saying, so the CSS working group, the standards body, they've invented this concept of media queries. And it's like, why don't we use these to make one website that works with both mobiles and desktops, and it will responsively adapt to the size of your screen? And that was just absolutely amazing, like the fact that we could do this. And you have all these different examples on that article that were really cool. And if you ever want a history lesson, it's a really fun read. And that's what gave us responsive layouts. So we would, on one website, use media queries, and we'd start off with the CSS for the mobile view, and then we'd add on using media queries how it would change, how it would suddenly switch to like a completely different layout to make it more suitable for a larger screen size or viewport, to use the correct terminology. So that was great. And then, well, yeah, it was great, but there were some limitations to it. So what were those limitations? Someone is phoning me. I thought it was Keith then, but it's another Keith. Right, so what are the limitations of responsive web design? So there's certain issues like this. So you couldn't really know where the bottom of the screen was. Like, it was a bit of an unsolved problem. So like, this was an older version of the Newsround website. And if you had like a really, well, not a big screen, but like, you know, a standard size desktop monitor, you'd go on this page and the video player is so big you can barely see the play button. And that's just because there's no way of telling like how big your screen is. I mean, maybe you could have some complicated media queries to work that out, but you didn't really do that. It was way too much effort considering all these different scenarios. So that was a bit difficult. And the other issue was you couldn't really mix the fluid and fixed layout. So you couldn't have, say, like a sidebar that's a fixed width and like all the other columns use percentages or something like that. It had to be one or the other. So like in this example here, our gel grid, the grid we use at the BBC in all of our websites, like this is having this same issue as well. It's like as you squash it, as you stretch it, it's always sticking to these same percentage values, and you can't really get around that. So yeah, we'd have to, in our designs, be thinking about all these different breakpoints, and yeah, everything had to fit to these breakpoints, and then you'd suddenly jar and go over to a different layout. Something else I was going to say on this, but I've forgotten. But yeah, that was our basic issues with that. So what is it that we have now? What is this amazing tomorrow that we're going into that is going to just revolutionize everything? And I really hope I can get that across to you, how exciting this is. So for us at the BBC and for many other companies, they're all thinking about design systems these days. So not just making, I guess, a big website in one go, but they're splitting it all up into different components and like what you might call tokens or other things like that, where you're defining in one standard place, getting the developers and designers together to define what fonts we're going to use, what does a button look like, what does, I don't know, a text box look like, all those kinds of things, and put them all together to make a website like a jigsaw, I guess. That's a really crude example of a design system. So that's what we're working on now at the BBC, to have one consistent design system for our whole websites. And yeah, there's been a big revolution in the web in the past, well, actually, I guess 10 years, actually, but a lot of things have been accumulating, I guess, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years. And we've got all these amazing technologies now. CSS grids, that's a really big, important one. Flexbox, multi-columns, that's a really old one, but it was very buggy in the past. Now it's becoming quite stable and usable. We've got like feature detection now built into CSS as well. We've got @ support. There's this new feature coming out called aspect ratio. You can actually put things in a particular aspect ratio. It's all these cool functions like min-max, and they're all worth checking out, really, really cool. And if we combine all these things together, we can do something that has never been possible before on the web. So 1.5 years ago, I went to the Mozilla conference in London, and I didn't realize at the time, but I seemed to be at like the epicenter of this revolution that was going on in the web. And the talk was being given at the very end by this lady called Jen Simmons. Has anyone heard of Jen Simmons? Yes, one person. So Jen Simmons is absolutely amazing. She works for Mozilla as one of their developer relations people, I guess, or whatever you call them. And she is involved in the CSS working group, the standards body that work on CSS. And she was giving this really amazing talk that was basically, I guess, doing what I'm trying to do now as well, which is like to inspire people about this thing that she's realized about what we can now do with CSS if you combine all these different technologies together. And what she called it was, oh, sorry, that slide comes later. So what she said was, the more I understand what CS Grid wants to do, I realize that we're in a new era of web design. This is not responsive layout. This is something different. And she made this really cool timeline as well of where we've been through in the web to get to this point, which I've kind of ripped off to do the beginning of this talk. What is it? Well, it's responsive web design. Actually, that wasn't a very good animation. It's responsive web design. No, it's responsive web design. Yeah, this one's good. It's responsive web design. Absolutely amazing. This is the future of the web. You excited yet? So what actually is response? You see, I'm doing it again. Intrinsic web design. What is intrinsic web design? Getting them mixed up. So basically, it's like getting rid of media queries. Media queries were cool, but they're actually limiting us. So what can we do instead of using media queries? So the idea is it's a bit more compatible with design systems. So you can basically set constraints on your individual components on your websites. So whether they are a card, like in this example, to link off to an article or something like that. So you can get it so that it knows kind of what space it's in, and it can relay itself out accordingly to how much space it has. So it's quite, I mean, there's much more to it than this, but this is, I guess, the main use case of what you can do with intrinsic web design. It's really, really powerful. So let's see what we can do with it. So this was an example I did. So this website I'm showing you now has absolutely no media queries on it whatsoever. But look what's happening. We've got a sidebar, and the sidebar disappears when we're at a smaller breakpoint because it's appearing underneath a list. It's we've got a grid there of all those different cards, and all of those cards are switching themselves automatically between portrait and landscape depending on how much space they have. So all this is happening without any media queries whatsoever, which is not something we could do at all 5 years ago. It's absolutely revolutionary. So this changes everything. And I guess the hardest thing with this is trying to tell a designer in your team, you don't have to use breakpoints anymore. And it's like, wait, but what? So how do I make it responsive then? And it's like, well, you can make it responsive, but you can, you just have to set constraints on all of the components that you're working on. It's like, what? It's a really crazy thing to get your head around. And you're putting, well, as one designer put it, you're putting your trust in the computer almost to figure out your design for you. Not exactly, because you are setting a lot of constraints and control, but it is a very different mindset to how we do things at the moment, and you really have to get your head around it and figure out how to do it. So I've been, not cheating, but I've been, so basically what I was showing you there, none of it was, I guess, my own code or ideas as such. It was from this amazing book called Every Layout. I don't know if anyone's heard of this. So it's written by two people called Hayden Pickering and Andy Bell. And they are, I guess, like Jen Simmons, quite into this topic of intrinsic web design. And they really want to I guess, evangelize it and create like these really nice, simple patterns that are easily shareable, that you can show people what intrinsic web design is and how you can use it. So they've created this book, and it's absolutely brilliant. We use it in our team at work, and it shows you common tropes, I guess, in how layouts are done. Like they've literally called it every layout. This is every layout in the whole of the web. And this is how you do it with intrinsic web design. So that example I was showing you earlier, it's using 3 patterns there. So one, you've got the grid, and that grid is just trying to put as many cells as it can in a row that it has room for, and it tries to keep them to a certain size. We've got that sidebar, but the sidebar is special because it's not, set with percentages. It's got one fixed sidebar, and then the main area is fluid and can do whatever it wants. And then we've got that switcher pattern, which is where like something can switch between portrait and landscape depending on how much space it has, essentially. So that's what we were using to flip the card between portrait and landscape. So yeah, intrinsic web design is something that's come at a great time, because as we're working on these design systems, this is what's going to allow our design systems to be really flexible and reusable, because you can put all of your components in different places, and you don't so much have to worry about how they're going to render, because because the intrinsic design system is going to rejig it all for you, so it all fits and works in the context that they're in. So I don't know if you've heard of this, like people have been crying out for this concept of like container queries, so not like media queries, but container queries. So you're able to change something based on like the size of an element or something like that. And it's like, we don't need container queries as such, because we have this now. Right now, we can do all these things. We can respond to like the shape and the size of a particular component and change the stuff inside it accordingly. It's really powerful. So how are we using it at the BBC? Well, we're not. Not yet anyway, but like this is something we really are heavily thinking about. We are doing some prototypes. So someone in our team, he's a designer, he's been thinking about how they could use this sidebar for a video page. So here's a prototype that he made. And you can see how it's using that sidebar pattern, and it just works. Like no media queries, you've got this amazing experience with very little code, getting all that working. So it's really, it's really powerful. I should probably have a drink. So yeah, I'm wondering then, like how, like it's very difficult to, I guess, kind of get this across in 5 minutes, but how do we actually achieve this? So how do you get intrinsic web design working in your design system? So I thought I'd give you a little sample of how that grid was working, just as an example of how this kind of code works. So it's just 3 lines of code. And actually, really, it's only 1 line of code that's actually doing the magic. So we're telling this container for the grid that it's going to be a grid, so display grid. We're giving it how big the gap should be between the cells. And this is the magic bit here. And it's a bit complicated because it's got functions and functions. But it's saying, so repeat as many cells as you can in each row, or sorry, it says column, so make as many columns as you can on this grid and try and stretch them out, fit as many as you can in there, and then we've got this min-max function here. So it's saying make them at a minimum 500 pixels wide and as big as 1 fraction, and I won't explain that now, but fraction is quite a cool measuring unit in CSS. That's quite new as well. And that's all it is. And you've got this intrinsic grid, and it's really powerful. So one principle that we use when you're working on intrinsic web design is not to use media queries. Try to avoid them at all if you can, because that's how it works, basically. So the second thing that we are doing in our team, in our design system to enable this, is we're trying to split out the layouts from the actual kind of content components themselves. So so we're trying not to like tell these cards, for example, how to lay themselves out. We're trying to encourage them to use separate layout components. So we have encapsulated within separate components within our design system, we're using React, by the way, different layout concepts. So for example, that grid, you could imagine it in there like it's using that intrinsic grid, and you just have to pull that component in, and then you can put whatever it is in there, like cards or something like that, and it will just work. And in your design system, you've got one consistent place where you're defining what a grid should look like. So another thing is try not to get a component to like go out of bounds, I suppose. Have it so it only concentrates on the styles of what's inside it. So in other words, don't set margins on components. So let something outside of that worry about stuff like that. So like in the grid example, we let the grid set the size of the gap, not the individual cells inside that grid. And likewise, you might have a paragraphs of text in an article. So you just, from the outside, in this example here, use this selector, so asterisk plus asterisk. So basically, everything excited me except the first one. Give it a margin top of 1 rem, so 16 pixels. So that's how you would maybe, for example, get your paragraphs in an article. So that makes it really reusable, and it gets rid of a lot of complications, basically, in the design system. The next thing is try to encapsulate the styles of the component within that component. So don't, for example, from the outside of that component say, right, make this thing 50% width or make it pink or something like that. Because, again, you want to make sure the component itself has full control over how it looks. And then another important point is be careful about how you mix intrinsic layouts with the old responsive layouts and media queries, because it often maybe doesn't go how you planned. Like, for example, say you're using that intrinsic grid, but you're using a more responsive method to flip them between portrait and landscape, that you'll find that doesn't really work very well. You're getting quite a jarring experience, or maybe it's not as you expect as you change the size of the viewport. So watch out for things like that. So yeah, we're getting to the end now. So what do we need to do, I guess, to learn more about intrinsic web design and get it on our websites? So yeah, spread this to everyone you know. I think at this stage, this is still quite an early concept, and it's in the early days, a bit like responsive web design was 2 years after that article was written. We need to be sharing with designers and getting them excited about what they can now do on the web. So yeah, share this with everyone you know, basically, and tell them about how powerful the web is now for laying stuff out. And yeah, have a play around with CSS and Flexbox. There's some websites out there that are really cool and have some really fun tutorials and things like that to teach you how to use them. And then finally, so I mentioned Jen Simmons, but there's 2 other people. So we've got Rachel Andrews, who is an independent member of the CSS working group. She talks about this a lot as well. She was the one who actually got CSS grids onto the web, because it was actually just a proprietary Microsoft thing before. Microsoft created it for Windows 8 so that you could make the apps in Windows 8, but then not Jen Simmons, but Rachel Andrews saw that and was like, why don't we have this on the web as a native thing? It would be amazing. And then we have Adam Argyle, so he's a developer evangelist at Google, so has a similar job to Jen Simmons. And so these are people who are really championing this right now. So I recommend following them on Twitter or going on their websites, where a lot of them have really cool examples of how you can achieve this, particularly Jen Simmons. So yeah, have a play with it. See what you can do today. There's other things coming up in the future that the CSS working groups are working on. So I was saying, we don't have container queries, but actually, funnily enough, as of last week, they have started thinking about how we might actually do real container queries on the web. So Adam Argyle on Twitter has linked recently to a proposal of how they might do that. So that's pretty cool, but we won't be able to use that for probably another 3 years. So yeah, learn what we can do at the moment, because it's absolutely amazing. Thanks for listening.